Letter 52 of Evelina. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Evelina by Fanny Burney. Letter 52. Evelina in continuation. Holborn, July 1st, 5 o'clock in the morning. Oh, Sir, what an adventure have I to write! All night it has occupied my thoughts, and I am now risen thus early to write it to you. Yesterday it was settled that we should spend the evening in Marybone Gardens, where Monsieur Torre, a celebrated foreigner, was to exhibit some fireworks. The party consisted of Madame Duval, all the Branghtons, Monsieur Du Bois, Mr. Smith, and Mr. Brown. We were almost the first persons who entered the gardens, Mr. Branghton having declared he would have all he could get for his money, which at best was only fooled away at such silly and idle places. We walked in parties, and very much detached from one another. Mr. Brown and Miss Polly led the way by themselves, Miss Branghton and Mr. Smith followed, and the latter seemed determined to be revenged for my behaviour at the ball, by transferring all his former affection for me to Miss Branghton, who received it with an air of exultation; and very frequently they each of them, though from different motives, looked back to discover whether I observed their good intelligence. Madame Duval walked with Monsieur Du Bois, and Mr. Branghton by himself; but his son would willingly have attached himself wholly to me, saying frequently, "Come, Miss, let's you and I have a little fun together. You see they've all left us, so now let's leave them." But I begged to be excused, and went to the other side of Madame Duval. This garden, as it is called, is neither striking for magnificence nor for beauty; and we were all so dull and languid, that I was extremely glad when we were summoned to the orchestra, upon the opening of a concert; in the course of which I had the pleasure of hearing a concerto on the violin by Mr. Barthelman, who to me seems a player of exquisite fancy, feeling, and variety. When notice was given us that the fireworks were preparing, we hurried along to secure good places for the sight; but very soon we were so encircled and incommoded by the crowd, that Mr. Smith proposed the ladies should make interest for a form to stand on. This was soon effected, and the men then left us to accommodate themselves better, saying they would return the moment the exhibition was over. The firework was really beautiful, and told with wonderful ingenuity the story of Orpheus and Eurydice; but at the moment of the fatal look which separated them for ever, there was such an explosion of fire, and so horrible a noise, that we all, as of one accord, jumped hastily from the form, and ran away some paces, fearing that we were in danger of mischief, from the innumerable sparks of fire which glittered in the air. For a moment or two I neither knew nor considered whither I had run; but my recollection was soon awakened by a stranger's addressing me with, "Come along, my dear, and I'll take care of you." I started, and then, to my great terror, perceived that I had outrun all my companions, and saw not one human being I knew. With all the speed in my power, and forgetful of my first fright, I hastened back to the place I had left, but found the form occupied by a new set of people. In vain, from side to side, I looked for some face I knew. I found myself in the midst of a crowd, yet without party, friend, or acquaintance. I walked in disordered haste from place to place, without knowing which way to turn, or whither I went. Every other moment I was spoke to by some bold and unfeeling man, to whom my distress, which I think must be very apparent, only furnished a pretence for impertinent witticisms, or free gallantry. At last a young officer, marching fiercely up to me, said, "You are a sweet pretty creature, and I enlist you in my service." And then, with great violence, he seized my hand. I screamed aloud with fear, and forcibly snatching it away, I ran hastily up to two ladies, and cried, "For Heaven's sake, dear ladies, afford me some protection." They heard me with a loud laugh, but very readily said, "Ay, let her walk between us," and each of them took hold of an arm. Then, in a drawling, ironical tone of voice, they asked what had frightened my little ladyship. I told them my adventure very simply, and entreated they would have the goodness to assist me in finding my friends. "Oh yes, to be sure," they said, "I should not want for friends, whilst I was with them." Mine, I said, would be very grateful for any civilities with which they might favour me. But imagine, my dear Sir, how I must have been confounded, when I observed that every other word I spoke produced a loud laugh. However, I will not dwell upon a conversation which soon, to my inexpressible horror, convinced me I had sought protection from insult of those who were themselves most likely to offer it. You, my dearest Sir, I well know, will both feel for and pity my terror, which I have no words to describe. Had I been at liberty, I should have instantly run away from them, when I made the shocking discovery; but as they held me fast, that was utterly impossible; and such was my dread of their resentment or abuse, that I did not dare make any open attempt to escape. They asked me 1,000 questions, accompanied by as many halloos, of who I was, what I was, and whence I came. My answers were very incoherent; but what, good Heaven, were my emotions, when, a few moments afterwards, I perceived advancing our way Lord Orville! Never shall I forget what I felt at that instant. Had I, indeed, been sunk to the guilty state which such companions might lead him to suspect, I could scarce have had feelings more cruelly depressing. However, to my infinite joy, he passed us without distinguishing me, though I saw that in a careless manner his eyes surveyed the party. As soon as he was gone, one of these unhappy women said, "Do you know that young fellow?" Not thinking it possible she should mean Lord Orville by such a term, I readily answered, "No, Madam." "Why, then," answered she, "you have a monstrous good stare for a little country miss." I now found I had mistaken her, but was glad to avoid an explanation. A few minutes after, what was my delight to hear the voice of Mr. Brown, who called out, "Lord, in that Miss what's her name?" "Thank God," cried I, suddenly springing from them both, "thank God, I have found my party!" Mr. Brown was, however, alone, and, without knowing what I did, I took hold of his arm. "Lord, Miss," cried he, "we've had such a hunt you can't think. Some of them thought he was gone home; but I says I don't think, says I, that she's like to go home all alone, says I." "And so that gentleman belongs to you, Miss, does he?" said one of the women. "Yes, Madam," answered I; "and now I thank you for your civility, but, as I am safe, will not give you any further trouble." I courtsied slightly, and would have walked away; but, most unfortunately, Madame Duval and the two Miss Branghtons just then joined us. They all began to make 1,000 enquiries, to which I briefly answered, that I had been obliged to these two ladies for walking with me, and would tell them more yet another time; for, though I felt great comparative courage, I was yet too much intimidated by their presence to dare be explicit. Nevertheless, I ventured once more to wish them a good night, and proposed seeking Mr. Branghton. These unhappy women listened to all that was said with a kind of callous curiosity, and seemed determined not to take any hint. But my vexation was terribly augmented, when, after having whispered something to each other, they very cavalierly declared that they intended joining our party. And then one of them very boldly took hold of my arm, while the other, going round, seized that of Mr. Brown. And thus, almost forcibly, we were moved on between them, and followed by Madame Duval and the Miss Branghtons. It would be very difficult to say which was greatest, my fright or Mr. Brown's consternation, who ventured not to make the least resistance, though his uneasiness made him tremble almost as much as myself. I would instantly have withdrawn my arm, but it was held so tight I could not move it; and poor Mr. Brown was circumstanced in the same manner on the other side; for I heard him say, "Lord, Ma'am, there's no need to squeeze one's arm so." And this was our situation, for we had not taken 3 steps, when, oh, Sir, we again met Lord Orville! But not again did he pass quietly by us. Unhappily, I caught his eye. Both mine immediately were bent to the ground; but he approached me, and we all stopped. I then looked up; he bowed. Good God, with what expressive eyes did he regard me! Never was surprise and concern so strongly marked. Yes, my dear Sir, he looked greatly concerned; and that, the remembrance of that, is the only consolation I feel for an evening the most painful of my life. What he said I know not, for, indeed, I seemed to have neither ears nor understanding; but I recollect that I only courtsied in silence. He paused for an instant, as if, I believe so, as if unwilling to pass on, and then, finding the whole party detained, he again bowed and took leave. Indeed, my dear Sir, I thought I should have fainted, so great was my emotion, from shame, vexation, and 1,000 other feelings, for which I have no expression. I absolutely tore myself from the woman's arms; and then, disengaging myself from that of Mr. Brown, I went to Madame Duval, and besought that she would not suffer me to be again parted from her. I fancy that Lord